She had polished those same tiles for 20 years until they shone like a quiet sunrise, until the house's corners could hold no more of her small, private errands. Before dawn, when the mist still clung to the agave and the dogs only dreamed, Rosa would lift the chipped clay mug to her lips and let the coffee fill the hollow that every long morning had worn into her chest. Her hands told stories, thin white scars across her knuckles, a deeper burn that puckered her left thumb from a pot of boiling syrup years ago. They were not the hands of a woman who asked for much. They were the hands of a woman who kept what she loved with fierce, everyday devotion. The hacienda rose up from the valley like a memory, thick adobe walls, courtyards ringed with jacaranda, tile roofs warmed by the sun. Don Rafael's house had been the shape of a life for half the town. Weddings and wakes, harvest nights, the creak of the sugar press in July. Rosa had been there longer than many of the younger workers could remember. She knew exactly how the ghost of a smell would tell her which room had been used. She could coax dirt from the deepest seam of a rug with a patience learned at her mother's knee. There were places on the estate no one else touched, because Rosa kept them untouched. An upstairs wing that had been closed after Senora Maria's death. A small walk-in closet in the study that held old winter linens and a cedar chest. She loved routine as others loved prayer. She rose to the rooster's first call, not because she feared the masters, but because order steadied her. She made tortillas with fingers that remembered heat and rhythm, and in the evening she would spread a small cloth on a low table and place a saucer of mole for her supper, an offering to the past that had fed the present. There was a photograph, folded at the bottom of her broom cupboard, the edges worn soft from being fingered when the night felt too long. A woman with her hair kinned in 2 tight braids and a child on her hip. Rosa kept it like a secret lamp. That morning, the dawn was a pale promise. Rosa had been sent to the northwest wing to sweep and to air the closed rooms before the visiting cousins arrived for the harvest festival. The northwest had been closed since Don Rafael fell ill, heavy curtains drawn against dust, a faint smell of lemon oil that had not faded. The door would stick at the bottom, so Rosa always tugged it open with the heel of her palm, humming under her breath the old lullaby her mother used to hum in the darkness. She pushed the broom into the room, and the light came in a thin band, revealing furniture asleep under sheets, a dressing table speckled with the ghost of perfume, a cradle tucked in the corner as if someone had simply stepped away. It should have been so ordinary. A sweep, a quick airing, the dust motes catching the morning like tiny amber moons. But then she heard it, a sound so small and strange that for a moment Rosa thought the house itself had caught its breath. A rustle, a tiny whimpering note that rose and fell like a bird with an injured wing. Rosa set the broom aside slowly, the wood's grain familiar under her palm, and walked toward the sound. Cotton brushed against skin. Under a pile of old linens, beneath a moth-eaten blanket that smelled faintly of camphor and lavender, a face the color of milk peered up at her. 2 eyes, wet and astonished, blinked in the dim. The bundle shifted, and a thin, broken cry unfurled. The baby was wrapped so tightly it seemed as if whoever had left him had wanted to press every danger from him. But his hands were small and cool. His chest rose and fell with the fragile business of breath. Rosa crouched without thinking, the wood hard beneath her knees, the sun catching in the baby's hair. She could feel her jaw go slack, as if some unseen hand had unclenched the tight coil inside her. She had seen many things in 20 years. Sickness, stubborn old men clinging to the past, the way children faded when winters were hard. But she had never found life abandoned like an afterthought in the master's house. Rosa moved with the simplicity of someone who had lived among necessity. She untied the frayed string at the blanket's edge, slipped the infant against her chest, felt the warmth of his skin through the cloth. He smelled of dust and something faintly sweet, milk or flowers. His cry softened at the pressure of her shoulder, as if the small body recognized what hands knew how to hold. She knew at once that there was no time for questions that morning. There was only the single urgent task of keeping the child alive. She wrapped him in her own shawl, the serape woven by her mother's cousin, a piece of color she only used when someone important came for dinner. Her hands were sure as she cradled him, making a nest against the curve of her arm. She went to the stove in the courtyard, set a small pot of water to warm, crushed a little chili leaf for the air, and heated some milk. The beans were still soaking in a pot by the door. She warmed a spoon for the baby's lips and held him to her breast for a moment because it was the only thing she knew that ached like a lullaby. The baby's eyelids fluttered, closed, opened, trusting in the rhythm she offered. For a woman whose life had been measured in small kindnesses, Rosa made space for one more. She sat in the corner of the quiet wing, feet tucked under, rocking with emotion as old as the house, and sang the lullaby her mother had taught her. The words were not much, repeated phrases about the moon and the corn, a plea to the saints that children sleep and stay. It had always been enough to soothe a favored child or to patch a frayed heart. The baby's breathing slowed. His cries leaked into contented sighs. Rosa let out a breath she had not known she'd been holding and pressed her forehead to his.
It was not, she thought with a kind of stunned clarity, the house that had abandoned him. It was someone who had made a choice to leave him there, in the room she had always kept clean. The thought did not harden into blame, because blame did not help. It only settled like a stone in her stomach. She wrapped the baby tighter and held him as if sheltering a small, fragile country from a storm. The first choice was the simplest: get him to shelter, not to let the sun's heat or the eyes of the world find him in the wrong place. She stepped into the courtyard, where the air smelled of coffee and wet earth, and cupped the baby between her forearms, moving with the soft confidence of a woman who knew where every bowl and blanket was kept. Lupita would be in the wash house, Esteban cutting the sugar cane, the priest at the chapel. There were people who would know what to do. The world, in its old, imperfect way, held hands. Word traveled faster than Rosa could stitch a blanket. It always did. By the time she reached the small kitchen behind the chapel, the cook had seen her pass and the neighbors had already begun to whisper. The voice that carried fastest was not the one she wanted to hear, Valentina's. Valentina had arrived at the Hacienda 2 summers before, all new lace and sharper angles, a niece come to manage what she called the modern estate. She walked as if the cobblestones had been laid for her feet, and her words were always a little too polished for the kitchen's air. Where Don Raphael had ruled with a slow, strange tenderness, Valentina moved through rooms like a wind, ready to rearrange furniture and lives alike. When Valentina saw Rosa with the child, the expression on her face was a shutter slamming. Suspicion took a sculpted shape on her lips, quick and practiced. She did not ask if the child was all right. She did not notice the shawl Rosa had wrapped around the infant's head. Instead, she measured the moment as one measures a ledger. What could this mean for the estate, for appearances, for control? People watch the face of the powerful to see how they will be judged. For Rosa, the look welded itself to decades of quiet being. She had felt this look before, at the market, in church, when a man refused to meet her eyes. But the weight of Valentina's glance had a different climate. It did not consider her humanity. It parsed her as a problem. You took him from where? Valentina's voice was thin, brittle. This is the house, Rosa. This is a place of order. Rosa's hands tightened around the baby, not out of defiance, but instinct. In the closed room, Senora, she said softly. A child was left under the linens. And you're sure someone didn't leave him to implicate you? Valentina asked, eyes flint. We must be careful. The town will not like a story that begins with neglect. It was never the question, what had happened, that mattered to Valentina. It was what could be made of it.
She was already thinking of the neighbors, the visiting cousins, of what her friends in the capital might say in the newspapers. An abandoned infant in the master's house would make tidy copy. It would demand a culprit. Someone would have to be made to carry the shame. Rumor grew like wild grass. The commissario came, a man whose uniform strained at the buttons, and whose appetite for drama exceeded his patience for nuance. He asked the kind of sharp, leading questions that forced answers into shapes he preferred. Who found him? Who has access to these rooms? Who has motive? Voices layered upon voices. Someone suggested a petty theft. Someone else murmured that perhaps Rosa had been hiding a child of her own. The town's easier stories, of the servant with a secret, are the ones rumor tends to choose. They looked for physical signs to anchor their suspicions. Valentina, furious and careful, found things to point to: a scrap of cloth with a seam that matched one of Rosa's worn shawls, a small coin that had been missing from the master's drawer, the kind of detail that can be made to frame a narrative if you are wielding it, found, produced, interpreted. It is an unfortunate truth that the poor can be blamed with inventions that will not stand up to sunlight. Rosa's quiet was its own defense, but it was also a fragile shield. The kitchen became a place where whispers hung like cloths on a line, drying. Some looked at her with the old, small pity reserved for people who know the taste of hard work. Others watched with a predatory curiosity, waiting to see if this would turn into scandal. The baby slept, unaware, small chest rising under the shawl, while the men in the yard argued about procedures and paperwork, as if the child's life were a problem of forms. And there were those who saw the obvious cruelty in the quickly assigned guilt. Father Miguel, whose robes had seen more dust than embroidery, seemed to have been waiting all his life for this kind of emergency. When he heard of the child, he came with a bowl and 2 pairs of hands that were both practical and empathetic. He did not bargain or ask for proof. He wrapped blankets with patient fingers and said a few quiet words over the infant for the saints to guide him. "We care for children," he told the small gathering. "It is what we do." His voice settled like a hand on a worry. Esteban, the capataz, watched the exchange with the kind of attention only those who have lived long under the skin of a place can have. He had been at Don Rafael's side for decades, a man whose back bore the shape of the land itself. He knew Rosa as a worker and as a woman who had raised other people's babies and the wages of their grief. He had a loyalty that was stubborn and often unspoken. Even so, loyalty in small towns can be a dangerous thing because it pits people against positions. He would not stand up immediately. He took the measure of the room before he committed.
Licenciado Fuentes arrived the next afternoon, hair gray at the temples, a man whose eyes had been trained on signatures and seals for longer than most could remember. He had been Don Rafael's notary, entrusted with papers that smelled faintly of cigar smoke and cedar. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who knew that documents are slow weapons. They do their work not at a shout, but with a patient, legal tick. Valentina had called for him, not because she particularly wanted the truth, but because she wanted the semblance of process. When the notary came, he set his satchel down gently, nodded to Rosa, and asked where the child had been found. Rosa told him, holding the baby in both arms like a small, fragile liturgy. She answered with plainness because she had learned that elaborate explanations only invited scrutiny. The licenciado listened. He could see, in a way the others did not, that she was not a suspected thief, but a protector. Yet his work was made of paper, of wills, of the careful ink that could decide estates. He had come to examine the sealed portfolio in Don Rafael's study, a thing that had been kept closed at the request of the master, a set of papers that had waited like seeds under winter ground. He opened it with hands as careful as a doctor. The parchment inside smelled faintly of tobacco and thyme. There were letters tied with ribbon, a small ledger, a note that appeared to be a name. But the licenciado kept those things folded close in thought. He had a duty to follow ink and testament, to see who would legally inherit, and in turn who might be called responsible for the household's reputation. He let that duty sit for the moment like a heavy coin in his pocket, deciding it would not yet be spent. While the notary's mind turned, Valentina was preparing another kind of defense. She called people together in the main hall, relatives, the visiting cousins, the gardener, with the rhetoric of propriety. "We cannot allow the house to become the subject of gossip," she said, palms flat on the table where once Don Rafael's palm had rested. "If we do not act swiftly, this place will be ruined." Her words were like the clap of a hand, drawing everyone's attention to the idea of order and to their role in preserving appearances. And then, in the way the town's heart learns to beat to new rhythms, accusations became almost formal. There were petitions, small pages signed by the more timid of the household, voices that would not have spoken otherwise. The commissario took Rosa's name down with a pen that trembled like someone suddenly aware of consequence. "We must investigate," he said loudly, as if announcing such a thing would shield him from blame later. "We cannot have disorder." Rosa felt the world narrow. She had the baby, she had the shawl, the photograph of a woman whose face never changed no matter how many years passed. She had the knowledge of where everything kept was kept. But she did not have the social currency that made accusations stop at the right lips. She had only small faiths, in the priest, in her work, in the old ways that sometimes sheltered the weak. The first humiliation arrived in the form of a council, a half-official meeting in which questions were offered like knives. Someone asked if Rosa had given birth recently and hidden the child.
Another suggested she had been paid to hide sinners in the house to make someone else look worse. The commissario, who had enjoyed the power of being needed, demanded to search her trunk. Rosa, who had kept a small trunk beneath her bed with the photograph and one of her mother's braids stitched inside, felt as if each inspection was a small theft. She allowed them to look. There was nothing to hide. But in the world of suspicion, nothing is proof of innocence. To be known to be poor is to be suspect by default. It was Lupita, who had worked beside Rosa for 15 years, who stood and said, plainly, she found the child. She did not leave it. Lupita's voice shook at the beginning and steadied with a courage that could not be feigned. She spoke of how Rosa had nursed children through fevers, how she had left her own comforts to feed others. Her words did not stop the tide, but they did make a small pool of stillness. Esteban shifted, uneasy, but did not speak. Father Miguel kept his eyes on the child and his hands folded. Valentina, sensing the loosening of her control, increased her pressure. She asked the commissario to take Rosa to the town for questioning, to keep her away from the house so that she might not influence testimonies, or, in Valentina's phrasing, access more of the house's privileges. The commissario, glad to have decisive orders, arranged for a cart. It was the public crucible. It was the thing that would either cleanse or burn. Rosa, life held in her arms, felt the weight of eyes. Before they could move, Licenciado Fuentes placed a hand on Valentina's shoulder. "There is no need for haste," he said. His voice, calm as a ledger's margin, carried. He reminded them that the estate had rules and that a formal inquiry would avoid the kind of rash decisions that could do lasting harm. He suggested the child be taken to the chapel for sanctuary while they conducted their inquiries. Father Miguel nodded, and a small, urgent procession formed. A shawl here, a helping hand there, the only kind of machinery that moves with human compassion. Rosa handed the baby into the priest's arms with emotion that was both deliberate and reluctant. She had entrusted him to the very people who now questioned whether she was a guardian or a culprit. It felt to her as though she were setting the infant down on stepping stones of doubt. They walked through the courtyard like a procession of judgments. The town watched from a distance. Eyes that had greeted her for years now slid across her face as if looking for some telltale sign.
The children in the road mimicked the adults in whispers. A dog followed at its own slow pace, mouth panting in sympathy. Rosa kept her head high because there was a certain dignity in doing what she could do while the world around her reshaped facts into narratives. When the cart finally rolled out with the commissario and his papers, when Valentina returned to the halls with a face carved into new hardness, Rosa stayed behind by the chapel where Father Miguel had started a small fire to warm the infant and feed him. The priest's hands were the hands of someone who had seen 1,000 small wrongs and knew how to make room for at least one right. "Do you want me to come?" Esteban asked at her shoulder, voice low. Rosa looked at him and saw the years they shared reflected in his eyes, the times he had left his own supper to help a worker, the nights he had carried sacks through the rain. He had always been the backbone of the estate, the kind of man who took on other people's burdens without a mention. "No," Rosa said finally. "You must keep them from hurting him while I am gone. My name on their tongues shouldn't become a prayer for the child." Esteban nodded, not entirely certain what he agreed to, but knowing the thing had to be done. Lupita pressed a small bundle into Rosa's hand, extra cloth, a tiny carved rattle she had smuggled out from a market and kept for children like this. The gesture was weighty with meaning. Protect this. Remember us. As the cart thudded away, the weight of the hush settled. Rosa followed on foot until the commissario's cart disappeared around the bend, lifted for now by a small town's gust of curiosity. She walked back through the corridors with the smell of citrus and dust, the sun now high enough to make the tiles glow like skin. The hacienda seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a verdict it could fashion itself. In the quiet of the study, Licenciado Fuentes took out a sealed envelope he had kept for years, one Don Rafael had given to him in confidence, with instructions for a time that had not yet seemed to come. He had promised to open it only under certain conditions, if the family line became uncertain, if questions arose to which ink could answer. The notary did not open it for spectacle. He opened it because the house had reached a place where truth,
no matter how late, might help. He unfolded the brittle paper inside and read lines that pulled at the edges of a story he had known both too much and too little. There were references to a child, to care, to plaintive pleas who had been made in private and hidden in public. He set the letters down once, then picked them up again as if weight and ink might be the same. He did not show his hand. He tucked the papers back into his satchel, knowing that paper is a slow thing, and the right moment to speak is as much about courage as about timing.
Rosa sat that night in the narrow room she shared with 3 other women in the servants' quarter, the baby in a basket at her feet under the watch of Lupita. The moon had climbed above the fields and painted the whitewashed walls with a pale, honest light. She took out the small photograph from her trunk and laid it beside the basket, as if the faces within might anchor the child to a lineage of care. In the photograph, the woman's eyes held a weariness Rosa had inherited and a softness she could rely on. A memory rose up, sudden and sweet, a childhood scene of her mother washing clothes by the river, singing about a girl who would grow up strong enough to carry whole houses on her shoulders. Rosa had believed that as a child, believed that strength was a currency that could buy safety. The reality was different. Strength made you useful, but not always safe. The night creaked with small noises, the settlement of a house that had seen many years, and the baby slept, making tiny, perfect motions. Rosa watched him and thought of all the ways the world could complicate such a small life. She thought of the sealed envelope in the notary's satchel and the way the Lysianhado's face had read like a closed book. Could ink untangle a web of rumor? Could a paper restore a name taken by the cheap currency of suspicion? Outside the kitchen, someone laughed, a festival, a bitterly ordinary sound when one house was folding under pressure. Rosa folded her hands in her lap and felt the muscle in her thumb twitch. She thought of Valentina and the hardness that had come to the woman's eyes, the way she measured moments like inventories. Rosa did not hate her. She had no luxury for such a consuming thing. She had work to do. She had a child to keep warm, words to weave into a life that might otherwise unravel. In the morning, the town would gather at the chapel. The commissario would file his questions. Men in hats would lean on the gate and trade versions of events, each tending to their own moral balance. And somewhere, in a locked drawer or a safe wrapped in cedar, ink would wait. The Lysianhado would have to decide whether to pull it out and let the past speak, whether the law would be a shield or merely another instrument in a fight over reputation. Rosa slept that night with a shawl over her knees and the baby's small face turned toward her. Her dreams were filled with a woman in braids smiling in a field of corn, and a voice that said in a language of comfort, "You are never nothing." She woke before dawn as she always did, to the smell of coffee and the sound of the house waking, and the baby opened his eyes to see hers, the world newly framed by her steadfast gaze. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered, as crowds will for the shape of scandal. Men with hats and women with arms folded took stands as if they were the law. Valentina stood framed by the hallway like a portrait come to life, her dress crisp and her posture a manifesto.
Rosa arrived at the chapel steps, carrying only what she had to carry, a shawl, a photograph, a small piece of her history, and found that the town's justice often begins with a parade. The commissario read aloud questions that acted as verdicts, and the notary sat with his satchel closed, his face like a ledger that had read too many debts. Father Miguel stood at the altar with the baby in his arms, eyes soft, voice like the opening of a door. He did not accuse. He named the child and asked for protection. His words were small and practical: shelter, watchfulness, prayers. "You are accused of deceit," Valentina said out of the corner of the assembly, as if the accusation were merely a rhetorical exercise. Rosa felt the room shrink again, a familiar weight. She could have spoken, could have begged, could have cried out for justice. Instead, she chose facts and the steadiness of truth, the lint of the blanket, the way the cradle had been lined. She told them simply what had happened, how she found the child, how she had nursed him, and how the priest had sheltered him. Simple facts have a stubbornness that rumor cannot swallow when they are offered with outrage. The town listened. Some believed, some would always refuse. That is the melancholy of rumor. It is a hard thing to uproot once planted. But the licenciado's hand on the satchel was like a promise. He rose then and said, in his civil, slow way, that there were papers to be consulted, that the estate had obligations and secrets, and that before any further action was taken, facts would be sought in ink. His words landed like a stone in a river. They would ripple. Things had become quieter, not because the problem had been solved, but because the machinery of the household and the notary's pace had taken a seat at the table. People began to file away from the chapel, gossip folding into the day like laundry. Valentina's eyes found Rosa, and for a moment the two women regarded each other like two halves of a currency about to be spent. That afternoon, Rosa sat on the low wall by the courtyard and watched the light slide over the agave.
The baby slept in the chapel under Father Miguel's watch. Esteban finally came to sit beside her, with a basket of freshly boiled corn. He did not speak at first. The place between them was reserved for things that cannot be announced loudly. When he did speak, it was in the small, particular language of people who have tended the same land. "You did what any of us would do," Esteban said. Rosa let out a small laugh, without mirth. "Perhaps," she answered. "Perhaps not everyone." Esteban looked at her, uncertain whether to give a promise. "I will make sure no one steals from you while this goes on," he said. "I will make sure the workers remember how you have fed their children." Rosa's lips pressed together. Promises were fragile. "The child must be safe," she said. "That is all." Esteban nodded.
He rose and left her to her thoughts, moving like a man who felt his duty as if it were an old shirt he could not take off. Rosa sat with the sun on her shoulders and thought about what would come. She had managed a life of small remedies. Now she was pushed into the currents of big things: public opinion, legal paper, the shifting loyalties of family. She felt old with worry and young with a fierce protective tenderness she had not known she would carry. When dusk settled, the licenciado came to the little room where Rosa slept while the estate arrangements were debated. He set the satchel on the bed and pulled out one of the letters he had read earlier. "There are things here that belong to you," he said quietly, watching her face for the first sign of hope. "But ink is not a rescue. It will not fix the town's mouths overnight. Be careful." Rosa took the letter with hands that trembled just a little. The paper tasted of tobacco and time. She slid a finger beneath the folded edge, feeling the letters like keys. She did not read aloud. She held it against her heart, and for a moment the quiet was a small, fierce sanctuary. Outside, the night smelled of flowering cacti and the distant work of the Hacienda's machines coming to rest. Inside, in the basket that had become a crib, the baby slept and dreamed his small dreams, unaware that his existence had become the hinge on which a household and a town now balanced. The future lay like a road at dawn, long, uncertain, and bright with possibility. Rosa closed her eyes for a moment and dreamed of fields. She dreamed of a woman with braids and soft hands, who had once told her that those who keep the light in a house are the people who one day may have to stand in the doorway and call others in. She woke with a determination that had always been her companion. Whatever the town decided, she would guard this child. She would not let the world tell him who he was before she had had her chance to say his name. Outside the study, Licenciado Fuentes made a slow decision. Papers were inked things, yes, but words spoken in the right place could change the measure of rumor. He rose, closing the satchel, and walked toward the chapel, where Father Miguel tended the small charge of sleeping life. He did not hurry, for he had learned that haste makes for bad law. He carried the sealed letter like a slow promise, a thing that might one day rewrite how a house remembered its own. Inside the house, Valentina paced, counting the cost of scandal as if it were currency. She had plans and reputations to guard, and a sense that everything had to be settled before the festival the following week. Her mind moved through possibilities with the efficiency of a woman who had been taught to keep everything precisely in order. To be wrong in the matter of reputation was to erode the very element she had built herself upon.
And in the dim corner of the chapel, where the lambent light came through the stained glass, Father Miguel rocked the baby gently and prayed in the simplified way that sometimes suffices for urgent need. "Be under my care," he murmured. "We will make room. We will not let the town hunger for a child." He looked up as the notary entered, and together they began to make small arrangements: straw by the cot, warm blankets, a note to the midwife in the next valley. A night stretched like a woven cloth, and the threads of accusation and loyalty braided together into a pattern none of them yet fully understood. Rosa slept with the photograph beneath her hand and the letter folded inside her satchel. She dreamed of a hand she had never seen, of a man who might have known of her and then turned away. The thought did not harden into resentment, it only settled into resolve. When dawn edged the world, there would be more questions, other confrontations. The licenciado would have to choose when to bring his papers into public view. Valentina would decide whether she cared for truth more than order. The comisario would sharpen his questions and perhaps grow tired of them. Esteban would keep watch. Lupita would bring hot coffee. Father Miguel would walk the short path between the chapel and the study with measured steps. For now, Rosa held fast to the small warmth in the basket beside her. She felt the slow rise and fall of the child, tiny, patient, obstinately alive, and she understood with a clarity that had the ring of revelation that some turned to their knees for.
Life in a person's hands is a responsibility that asks for everything and promises nothing. She would give everything she had. Beyond the chapel doors, the estate moved in the flow of tasks as if nothing had happened. But inside the rooms, in the drawers and the satchel and the locked chest, history had been nudged. A sealed paper had been opened enough to taste the air. The town had come to the chapel, but justice, like water, runs slowly, finding the cracks in time. In the sunlight that would soon sweep across the courtyard, Rosa rose with the baby wrapped to her breast, the photograph folded in a palm that did not let go. She would take the child to Father Miguel and then to the square, and then to whatever small tribunal would ask her to prove a life she had only begun to hold. She walked like someone who had always known the step of resilience, and though the world might try to press her down, she carried a small, fierce light against her chest that would not be snuffed out by rumor or by the hardened face of power. She walked to the chapel with the photograph folded in her palm and the baby's fate balanced like a question mark. The comisario had gone to gather statements. Valentina had returned to the house, already arranging the order of things as if a schedule could smooth over what suspicion had done.
Rosa had not sought the attention. She'd only done what she could in the moment when a small life needed warmth. Yet the world liked stories with villains and heroes, and her simplicity did not suit their drama. Before the meeting in the square could settle into something final, Father Miguel rose and raised his hand to gather a hush. The sunlight fell across the wooden pews in a stripe, and the baby, wrapped in a blanket not Rosa's, but chosen with the care of a priest who knew the touch of a mother's hands, slept with the kind of trust that had not yet been taught to the town. Father Miguel's voice was low but firm. "We will not let rumor be the law," he said. "We will seek truth." That was the first small victory, a sentence that asked the town to breathe before it judged. And while the town listened, Licenciado Fuentes took the satchel he had carried like a shadow and set it upon the altar rail. He did not make a show. That was not his way. He opened one document, then another, reading lines that belonged to another time, and the place seemed to tilt with the weight of old ink. There was a letter from Don Rafael, penmanship careful, and the paper browned at the edges, a request that if ever questions arose, these things should be known. There was mention of a woman from the river who had caught his attention years before, a name that matched the handwriting of the photograph Rosa kept hidden when nights felt too long. There was a clause about the care of children, and a clear instruction that those who protected and nurtured the vulnerable should be considered in the reckoning of the estate. Nothing in that language was a miracle. It was a cautious, late attempt by a man who had known secrets to put them in order. Licenciado Fuentes did not fling the documents like a verdict. He read aloud the parts that mattered: the name of a woman, Rosa's mother, mentioned in ink, a note that the master had considered a bond with that family, words that said the household must answer for its children. He spoke with the slow exactness of the law and the tenderness of a man who had long since seen what happened when paper is read without the mercy of context. The town listened, and for some, the letters were the beginning of a rearrangement of everything they thought they knew. "These papers do not erase suspicion," Licenciado Fuentes said. "They do not make truth a simple thing, but they are a record of intent. They call for care, they call for attention. We must allow them to be considered." The words settled like dust as the square murmured. Valentina's face was a mask of color drained to bone. A rumor had been planted. Now ink suggested a different seed. The town's appetite for certainty did not dissolve because a man in a black coat held a stack of papers. But the papers shifted the weight of conversation from rumor toward inquiry. That was something. Rosa stood where the chapel's cool shadow offered her a margin.
People came to her, some with suspicion still wet, others with the courage of those who live by small, steady loyalties. Lupita pressed fresh bread into her hand. Esteban, who had been silent so long that silence had become his language, put a broad palm on her shoulder and did not speak. A woman who had often been overlooked, an old seamstress who mended the collar of the town's shirts and knew the price of stitches. "If Don Rafael wrote these words," she said, "then they are not empty. Paper kept is a promise kept by the dead, sometimes more honest than the living." It was a small kindness to be public. For Rosa, whose life had been given to invisible competencies, knowing when the kettle would sing, how to judge the heat of an oven, public validation had a strange feeling. It warmed something fragile inside her, like sunlight warming a tile. She did not allow herself joy yet. Joy had a way of being stolen by hurried tongues. Instead, she folded the photograph back into her palm and let the day move. Before the town council, before the comisario and the cousins and the visiting relatives who had come to the harvest festival with ribbons in their hats, Licenciado Fuentes asked for patience. He would take the documents and consult with the proper authorities in the county. He would examine birth records, question the midwife in the village where Don Rafael once had a house, and, if necessary, call for testimonies. He was careful to say the law could move slowly and that blurred lines did not turn quickly into clear rights. The atmosphere bristled, some disappointed that it would not be over this week, some relieved that haste would be avoided. After that public statement, a small thing shifted in the town's mood. Suspicion did not evaporate, but it retreated into conversation. People swapped thoughts in thrummed tones in the markets and the fields. They watched Rosa with a new kind of attention, less like a subject and more like someone a story might finally be telling fairly. Valentina, who had been certain that rumor could be weaponized into control, found the ordinariness of procedure to be its own chastening. That evening she called Rosa into the parlor. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and the cooling lengths of the day. Valentina sat on the settee like a portrait posed to be admired. She had not been cruel to Rosa before the scandal. Cruelty had been economical in her life, an indicator used when resources or reputations needed defending. Now her voice carried the replanning of a person who had to account for a narrative that had run away from her neat hands. "You have been with this house for 20 years, Valentina said. You know things that others do not. I need to understand why a child would have been left here."
Rosa looked at her, and there was nothing performative in the way she held the photograph. She was not seeking confrontation. She was, even in this room, still the woman who tidied and cooked and kept the corners of the house clean. "I found him under linens," she said. "I warmed him. I brought him to the priest. I do not know who left him or why." Valentina's eyes narrowed, not with the hardness of a judge, but the perplexity of someone who had believed in strategy rather than mercy. "You must understand the position this puts the estate in," she said. "Visitors will come. People will think." Rosa's answer was simple, because truth rarely hides under fancy words. "People can think what they will. The child must be safe." There was a silence between them that felt like the hush before a storm, but it was not stormy. It was the kind of silence that allowed thought to be shaped. Valentina, who had built an identity out of control, found herself at a cusp. She could continue to sharpen the house's defenses, to make accusations and call for measures that would displace a woman who had done nothing but protect. Or she could let the slow, inconvenient truth of paper and compassion make their way. Before she could say more, a messenger from Licenciado Fuentes arrived with a note. There had been a preliminary confirmation of a midwife's memorandum, a page noting a birth from years before, a name that connected to the letter the notary had mentioned. The evidence was not absolute, but it made a pattern. When the messenger shared the note, a collective intake of breath moved through the room. Valentina's face moved through colors as a window sweeps through light. Her posture changed. She gathered the train of her dress as though reasserting ownership of its length. "We must be careful," she said. "We will not make declarations without proof." Rosa nodded. Proof was what the ink might bring. For now, her concern was smaller and more immediate. Food for the child, shelter, the sound of hands that would not pry questions into deep cots. She could not allow herself to be consumed by the future's demands. The present was a small life needing a blanket. In the days that followed, Licenciado Fuentes worked his methodical way through records. He traveled, he conferred with the registrar in the next town. He returned with notes from the midwife's ledger, small penciled lines that connected women, dates, and a name in the margin. The process was plodding and stubborn in its respect for detail. Every step he took required more waiting. Every line they read together required interpretation. For a people hungry for resolution, the law's pace can feel like a betrayal. For Rosa, who had lived by small, patient competencies, the delay was easier to inhabit because she knew how to carry care forward, day by day. Meanwhile, the town did what towns do. People took sides without the clarity of claims. Some neighbors, moved by the story of the small child, brought extra food to the chapel. The midwife from the valley, who had raised half the children in 3 surrounding towns, came to examine the baby and gave her quiet judgment. The child was young, likely not more than weeks old, and while thin from neglect, he was otherwise healthy enough to thrive. Her voice was practical rather than poetic. "He needs warmth and milk," she told the circle. "We will give him that. The rest will come in time."
Goodness in small acts began to knit the place the way water knits soil. Women from the market came with wool to knit little caps. Men who had once refused to lift a finger to help suddenly found it easy to fetch water or bring wood for the chapel stove. Esteban, who had been restrained by the quiet weight of years, took on tasks with a stubborn tenderness. He watched the child, brought extra blankets, served as a quiet envoy between Rosa and men who needed to be reminded that the dignity of their workers was not optional. Rumor did not die. It shifted. Where it had been sharp in accusation, it softened into question. Where it had been eager to punish, it grew uncertain about who deserved that punishment. The seed of paper that Licenciado Fuentes had carried grew a tendril of doubt about neat narratives. People in the market who had once been delighted by gossip found themselves unsettled. Children who had learned to replicate adult cruelties stopped because their elders' conversations had grown more complex. Valentina watched these changes, and for the first time since she had stepped into Don Rafael's house, felt the weight of being judged by her own measures. She spent nights awake considering the estate not as a ledger of profits, but as a living place with people whose daily hardships had names. In secret, she read some of Don Rafael's letters that Licenciado Fuentes had allowed her to consult, parchment that mentioned kindnesses and responsibilities. It was as if the man she had known in a certain light now revealed himself in hues that made her question the certainty she had built her identity upon. Her change did not arrive as a thunderclap. Pride is a patient habit. It will not surrender quickly. But small things softened her, seeing the children at the chapel, watching Rosa move with the steady, invisible authority of someone who had always held the house together, hearing a neighbor tell a story of how Rosa had once hidden a loaf of bread for a sick cousin. Empathy grew as an accumulation rather than a revelation. When the licenciado at last returned with documents that made the outline of a truth clearer, a birth record, Don Rafael's note, the midwife's ledger entry, he did not storm the square with triumph. He set the papers down in the main hall where a cluster of people had gathered and read the facts in the slow cadence of someone who respects the power of what he says.
The majority of the words said, Don Rafael had acknowledged in a private way connections that the house had let sit in the dark. He had asked the notary, should questions of loyalty and care emerge, to consider those who had tended the vulnerable in the reckoning of his affairs. There was, in the paper, no miracle of instant restoration. There was instead a clear suggestion of responsibility. There was mention that should the estate be divided or reorganized, those individuals who had long-standing bonds with the family and had been treated with negligence should not be left to want. The wording was not a direct transfer of property. It was a framework, an admonition written by a man who had lived with secrets and wanted to set them in order before his memory departed. The difference mattered. The townspeople could no longer simply point and say, she is a servant, with the casual certainty they had enjoyed. Paper had not waved away history, but it had given them the cause to consider the past's obligations. Valentina's face was unreadable as Licenciado Fuentes folded the documents and suggested they convene a formal parlor meeting to decide how best to honor the letter's intent while preserving the estate's functioning. It was in that gathering that a different conversation began. What does it mean to repair harm? How do you acknowledge a past without making enemies of those who had lived their lives around the same table? Some relatives wanted to keep the status quo, convinced that tradition was shield enough against change. Others, particularly women who had watched Rosa's steady kindness, asked for restitution in the form of more than words. Rosa listened to the back and forth, her hands folded in her lap, not because she aimed to be the center, but because the child's name had already settled in her heart. She had thought to call him Mateo at first, for reasons that felt private and immediate. Then she considered naming him after the woman in the photograph, Maria, because a child needs a string of names to anchor him in a place. Names are small maps that tell a person where they belong. It mattered to her that this child have a map. Esteban and Lupita spoke in her favor. Their words were not the dramatics of strangers. They were accounts of a woman who had served for decades with a dignity that some in the room had come to take for granted. She has fed my children, Esteban said simply. She has steadied this place. For that, she should not be punished. There was resistance. Some argued that because Rosa had been a servant, her testimony bore less weight. A cousin suggested that people of rank be protected from scandal, but the momentum of small kindnesses and the weight of paper made it difficult to hold on to such hard positions.
Gradually, the room softened toward a plan that did not cast Rosa as a beneficiary of unearned fortune, but as a recognized guardian, a place in which she would be entrusted with responsibilities and benefits that allowed her to care for the child and advocate for other workers. It was not the outright transfer of the house. That would have been a fiction incompatible with the era's legal and social structures. Instead, the group devised a practical arrangement, an appointed stewardship in which Rosa would be named a guardian of the child with legal recognition, supported by a trust that would provide for the child's upbringing and some funds designated for improving workers' conditions. Licenciado Fuentes drafted the language carefully. A guardian named, a trust established for education and health care, and a committee to oversee the distribution that included Esteban, Lupita, and a representative of the workers. There would be oversight. There would be limits. There would also be a real change in who had a voice at the house. When the idea was presented, there was murmuring. Someone noted the fairness of slow justice. Rosa heard the plan and felt a fierce, surprised gratitude. The arrangement did not make her wealthy. It did not give her the rights of a blooded owner overnight, but it did give the child, a small life that had begun inside a room that had been kept by her, the best possible chance the social structures of that time could provide. Valentina's reaction to the plan is worth recalling. She listened, her jaw moving as if words were stones she weighed. Then she stood and spoke in a voice that, at times, had been sharp as porcelain. "We must do right by this child," she said. Her tone was not performed contrition. It was the tentative shape of someone attempting humility publicly. If I have allowed haste or cruelty to move before thought, I will rectify it. Public apologies are odd things. They can be the beginning of real change or the theatrical closing of a case. Valentina's words were raw, as if she had been pricked by an unexpected sympathy and found that it hurt. She did not beg forgiveness with theatrics. She spoke of the fear of losing what she had built, and how that fear had taught her to defend rather than to listen. Her apology was not a full confession of motive, but a quiet acceptance that the house needed to be more than a ledger to be kept by one kind of person. Rosa met her across the table with the steady, unflinching gaze she had given an infant in a linened room. There was a new equilibrium between them now, not intimacy, not friendship, something firmer, mutual recognition. Rosa did not demand that Valentina's life be dismantled. She asked for simple things: an end to public humiliation, recognition of her role as guardian, better wages for women who washed, a modest health fund for the workers' children. The requests were practical and rooted in the dignity of labor. The town watched as the elders hammered out the language of the trust and the guardianship. Agreements were written on paper, then read aloud in the square, then signed in the presence of Padre Miguel, Licenciado Fuentes, Esteban, Lupita, and 2 other workers chosen by the staff. It was meticulous and slow, and it had the stamp of solemnity. The child, who had been unnamed in the first frantic hours, was christened in the small chapel, with Father Miguel performing the rite, the congregation small but sincere. Rosa stood with the photograph pressed against her chest, Esteban on one side, Lupita on the other, and Valentina in the back, hands folded like someone learning to let go. When the notary's pen sealed the arrangement, the sensation was not one of final victory, but of beginning. The trust would not feed every injustice previously committed. It would not rewrite decades of imbalance. Yet it would provide resources. It would give the child, now proudly called Mateo, an education fund, a caretaker, and the legal security to remain under Rosa's guardianship. For Rosa, who had lived 20 years in the currency of small mercies, the change felt like a widening of the walls she had always cleaned, not just to keep order, but to hold life. But life does not rearrange in order to make a single person safe. After the formalities, there were the quieter negotiations. The workers asked for better schedules, for an end to sudden punishments, for small raises that would make it possible to care for their families. Rosa insisted these things be part of the house's new compass. She did not ask for dramatic redistribution. She asked for basic recognition, fair hours, a modest fund for health, the right to sit at a table with a voice that mattered. Her demands were not revolutionary, they were humane. To those demands, Valentina responded with a tentative hand. She agreed to an initial fund and to the establishment of a committee that would include workers' representatives.
She arranged with Licenciado Fuentes for new payroll records to be kept and for a yearly accounting to be presented in the presence of Father Miguel and a workers' representative. It was, again, not a perfect justice, but it was a start, and in a world where change could be strangled by habit, beginnings are precious. Days turned into weeks, and the hacienda began to breathe differently. The table where workers once ate alone now saw on Sundays a communal meal. Rosa insisted that she cook, and her mole became a small ritual that drew the people together. She moved with the same hands that had once been invisible, now visible not as a servant's labor, but as stewardship. Men and women who had once been barred from the inner rooms found themselves entering them on days when tasks required collaborative work. The transformation was not seamless. Tradition has stubborn roots.
But the pattern of behavior changed because people could see a different order being recognized in ink and enacted in the smallest daily things. Valentina, too, changed. The hardness in her face softened into something like humility. She would walk through the kitchen now without being asked about menus. She would sit at the back of the communal meal and listen. She asked Esteban about the crop. She walked the fields with the workers and learned the names of people she had once assumed were interchangeable with duties. It did not make her wholly likable. People are not changed that quickly. But it made her a presence who could no longer hide behind appearances. Her apology, once a fragile thing, grew into small acts of reparation. She requested that a small room be set aside for a nurse to tend the estate's children. She paid for extra flower shipments when the rains threatened. These acts did not cancel the hurt of suspicion, but they were a beginning toward making amends. Rosa watched these changes with the quiet of someone who knows the danger of trusting too quickly. She sought no triumph, only the slow accrual of safety for Mateo and the people she loved. Her nights were still filled with the photograph of the woman by the river and the memory of her mother's hands working the wash. She kept the photograph in the kitchen now, propped near the hearth, and when she cooked, she would touch the worn edge, as if the hand there were a small compass. Mateo grew in the dusky warmth of the chapel and the bustling hush of the kitchen. He learned the sound of the olla simmering, the slap of fresh tortillas, the low hum of prayers at dusk. He grew strong enough to hold his head up and to reach for the fringe of Rosa's shawl. People who had once been quick to suspect now found themselves softening at the child's laugh. Children in the yard played at being him. Neighbors, once eager for gossip, passed him small gifts, a carved toy, a ribbon, a pair of tiny shoes. In the small, decisive arithmetic of community, little things added up. There were still those who would historically insist that a servant remain in her place. They balked at the thought of Rosa participating in meetings that once concerned only the family, but even they found their resistance eroding in the face of steady competence. Rosa did not seek conflict. She sought the practical, a place for the child to be safe, a table where voices mattered, a trust that could not be easily plundered. When decisions were needed about the estate's crops or the welfare of the laborers, Rosa's voice, tempered by decades of knowing the land, was heard. Her suggestions about rotating labor and about a small schoolroom beside the chapel were accepted because they made sense. They were not romantic speeches, but things that improved yields and attendance. The year turned. The harvest that followed the scandal was not the most bountiful in memory, but it was steady.
The workers, now knowing that complaints had a seat at the table, showed up with less fear of arbitrary punishments. Mothers brought their sick children to the nurse's room without whispering. Children who had once been forced to skip school to labor in the fields attended in the mornings, while workers rotated their shifts in a system Rosa helped design. The changes did not save everyone from hardship, but they made life less precarious. One afternoon, while the jacaranda tree shed its purple around the courtyard, Valentina sought Rosa out again. The two women sat not in the parlor nor on the settee, but at a chipped table in the kitchen, the table where tortillas were rolled and soup was ladled, the place where the house's real life took root. "I have been thinking," Valentina said, and for once the words were softer than the edge they had once carried. "I am sorry for the harm. It was my fear that made me act without thinking." Rosa listened. She did not want a spectacle of sentimentality. The occasion deserved an honest answer. "Fear makes many people quick," she said. "We all act from what we have learned. There is repair to do.
Sorry is a piece of it. Valentina lowered her gaze. Will you accept more assistance with the child? I can arrange for a teacher when he is ready. I want to help in ways that matter. Rosa looked at the woman whose life had been shaped by different necessities. She saw not a vanquished pride, but a human who had made mistakes. She could have demanded more: public contrition, a formal reparation, a list of injustices to be corrected. She did not. Rosa understood that demands can become new hierarchies, if not tempered by mercy. If you will help in ways that protect the children and the workers, she said, I will accept, but let it be for their sake, not to make us all feel better. Valentina's shoulders relaxed, as if some weight had been set down. For their sake, she repeated. Time, as it does, continued to tide over small and large events alike. Matteo learned to crawl, then to toddle, then to reach for the wooden spoon that Rosa used to stir her mole. He delighted when the chapel bells rang, responding to their sound with a smile that seemed to knit everyone's heart briefly into one. The notary's trust matured enough to fund his small needs. Legal guardianship ensured he remained in the care of the woman who had first sheltered him. The workers' committee met monthly and adjusted schedules and funds. The nurse kept better hours. Children were not hungry at dawn. There were still sharp memories. The commissario, who had once presided over a hurried search, no longer held the same power. He remained in his post, but his authority felt checked by the town's new habit of asking questions and not accepting easy answers. People who had once delighted in rumor now turned toward conversation, because conversation required something like responsibility.
At night, when the house fell into a hush, Rosa would sit by the baby's side, now a child with a smudge of curiosity on his chin, and pull out the photograph. She would tell him, in the small, secret language of the kitchen, stories of a woman who washed at the river and sung lullabies. She told Matteo about the ways love can be small and ordinary, and how such small things accumulate into a life's worth. He listened with the unquenchable attention of a child discovering the world. One evening in late winter, as frost rimmed the edge of the courtyard and the kitchen stove hummed, Licenciado Fuentes came to Rosa with a folded note. There is one more paper, he said, his eyes momentarily catching the light like an honest coin. He set it on the table between them, another of Don Rafael's marginal notes, perhaps an attachment he had overlooked. It was a simple sentence. In the event that questions arose, those who had acted with courage and care should be considered in decisions regarding the household. The calmness of the language felt like the slow humility of a man who had accepted his mortality. Rosa's fingers closed around the paper because she had learned to trust the slow measure of ink and the people who honored it. She thought of all that had passed, the small terror of finding a child beneath a blanket, the heavy look of suspicion, the tenderness of a priest, the steadfastness of a capatas and a seamstress, the careful work of a notary, and perhaps most surprisingly, the willingness of one woman to own her error publicly and then to act. The events had not cured inequality, but they had carved a new marker into the house's memory. On a morning when the sky was a thin, honest blue, the Hacienda held a small feast. It was not luxurious. No silver was laid out on the table, only bowls of stew, tortillas, a pot of coffee that steamed in the chill. Communities repaired themselves in such quiet ways. People ate, laughed, told stories of harvests and mishaps, and watched Matteo run over the courtyard stones with a wooden toy in his hand. Rosa stood by the pots, stirring, occasionally wiping flour from the child's cheek, and listened to the chatter of people who had come to learn that dignity has a way of returning when given the chance. In that scene, there was no final, dramatic triumph. Instead, there was a measured restoration. A house that had once assumed its own rules now negotiated them with people who had not been considered before. Rosa did not become a lady of the house overnight. She gained a measure of guardianship and a voice in matters that shaped lives. Her hands, those hands with white lines and a thumb puckered from syrup, continued to cook and clean. Their duties no longer meant invisibility. Night fell on the hacienda, and the jacaranda shed more purple on the path.
Rosa walked the small length between the kitchen and the servants' quarters, her steps the same and yet different, because the house was now a place that recognized the worth of those who kept it clean. She paused by a small window that looked down into the chapel, where Matteo slept under a shawl she had once reserved for important occasions. The child's breath was even. The moon laid a silver seam across his face. She took the photograph from where she kept it, the paper edges softened by years of handling, and pressed it to her heart. Her mother's face, braids and a patient smile, seemed to look back as if to say, not in words, but in a memory's gentle counsel, "You kept the light." Rosa felt a grandeur in that small recognition, a dignity that did not require public announcement. It lived in the steadiness of a woman who had been faithful in the trivial, and found that faithfulness could, in time, change measures. Valentina would visit less like a high mistress and more like someone requesting counsel from the people she once dismissed. She brought books for Matteo and sat in the back of the kitchen sometimes, asking about dishes and schedules. Her public tone grew less polished but more honest. She found herself apologizing again, but this time the apologies were followed by action. Work schedules were reformed, extra blankets were ordered for winter, and the nurses' hours were made steady. The town began to tell this story not as a tidy parable of redemption, but as a living history of how small, practical acts can shift the shape of a place. People would remember Rosa finding an infant under linens. They would speak of how she had held him while the town gossiped. They would recall the notary's careful reading of paper that had waited in cedar for a time to come. They would remember that compassion, when combined with justice framed by lawful words, can reshape expectations. On a morning months later, when the harvest moon had been replaced by the more ordinary sun, Rosa rose before dawn and went to the kitchen. The clay mug she lifted to her lips was warm, the coffee bitter and honest. She thought for a moment of the first morning she had found Matteo, and of the way the light had sliced across the room. She had been afraid then, and she had acted. Her life had always been measured in such acts. Now, as she prepared tortillas for the workers and held the photograph in the corner of her apron, she felt a quiet peace, not triumph, but the satisfaction of a duty kept. Matteo, now old enough to clap when she said his name, tumbled into the kitchen and grabbed for the spoon with a sticky grin. Rosa laughed in a sound that felt like a small bell. She scooped him up and held him close, her cheek against his, the softness of his hair against her skin. Outside, the fields breathed in the new season. Inside, bowls clinked and the house hummed with the ordinary music of people living.
She placed a small plate of mole before the child and watched as he shoved a chunk of tortilla into his mouth, smearing sauce on his chin. She wiped it with the corner of a cloth and felt, briefly, the entire house in that gesture. Hands that washed, hands that mended, hands that stirred, interlocking. The trust established by paper would need care. The fund that supported the child and the small reforms in work conditions would need vigilance. But there was now a structure through which such care could be maintained. That night, after the children were asleep and the house had folded its day into a soft hush, Rosa sat alone with the photograph and thought of lineage in a way that had nothing to do with titles. Don Raphael's pen had redirected a small part of the estate's memory, and the town, by common assent, had agreed to a different measure of order. For Rosa, the real change was ordinary: Matteo's laugh, the shared meal on Sundays, Esteban's watchful presence, the nurse's steady hours. Those things made life less precarious. They were not grand, but they were true. She pressed the photograph again and whispered to the woman whose face had been a secret lamp, "You were never nothing." The phrase had no altar. It needed none. It lived in the daily acts of a woman who had raised other people's children, who had kept a house when it was needed, and who now tended a small life that had begun under linens. In the hush of the night, the hacienda breathed, and the child slept, and the world, having been forced to reconsider itself, was quieter for it. In the years that followed, people would tell the story of a woman who found a child where no one expected a life to be, and who, through patience, the law's slow gears, and the quiet courage of neighbors, turned scandal into shelter. They would speak of a notary who kept papers like seeds for a spring yet to come, of a priest who held a child as though the future might duck into his palms, of a capataz who would stand by a friend, and of a woman who had once feared reputations, now learning to ask for more than appearances. On the edge of dawn, as the fields ripened and the jacaranda shed its final purple, Rosa placed Matteo by her side and walked to the courtyard. They looked out over the rows of sugarcane and the furrows where new things would be planted. In the distance, the village stirred. Rosa took the child's small hand and tucked it into the callus of her own. She did not know everything the future would bring, but she knew the small, sustaining truth. To protect a life is to change the world of that life, and sometimes that is the most radical thing one can do. If this story moved you, if Rosa's quiet courage and the town's slow change felt like something worth holding, please subscribe for more stories that remind us dignity matters.
The sun rose fully over the hacienda and lit the clay tiles in a long, steady sweep. Rosa held Mateo close as the chickens clucked in excited rhythms.
She thought of the woman in the photograph and the river songs, of all the small things that had added up to a life that meant something more than mere endurance. The house that once treated its servants like invisible fixtures had been nudged by ink, by care, and by the insistence of people who chose to speak for those who could not. Under that light, Rosa felt the future as a field waiting for planting, and she, with her hands that had known heat and rhythm, was ready to sow. Tell us, would you forgive Valentina? Share your thoughts below, and if this story touched you, like and share to remind someone that dignity and small acts of justice can change a life.